Tim, thanks for coming on again. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me back. I very much enjoyed our discussion a little bit over a month ago, whenever it was. So my name is Tim Mawson. I'm one of 2 philosophy fellows. That means tutors here at St. Peter's College, which is one of the colleges that constitutes the University of Oxford. And I'm particularly interested in philosophy of religion things, value things, topics in that area.
Cool. And I just added your paper to the thing, so it should be.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. So there was a paper that I suggested we might at least start by talking about some of the ideas in. And then as I understand it, anyone who wants to follow it up and look at the actual paper I might be referencing can follow a link in the description. And get to it. Yeah.
Cool. So today's topic was, should we have reasons to believe in God? And what is your position on that?
Yeah. So thank you. So that was a question we thought we'd start off with. Should we have reasons to believe in God? And so I thought that might be quite an interesting question, because quite often the question is asked of, do we have reasons to believe in God? Are the reasons we have to believe in God better than the reasons we have to disbelieve in him? Is it the sort of topic for which reasons are not available anyway, for whatever explanation might lie behind that? And I wanted to ask the question, which looks as if it has a certain methodological priority, of whether you should require reasons to believe in God before you believe in God. So what's the right ethics of belief for believing in God? Should you believe in God only if you really have positive reasons in favor of it, and these reasons outweigh any negative reasons you have against? Or is it at least permissible to believe in God even absent any net positive reasons for believing in him? Maybe only if you have defeaters to reasons to disbelieve in him. Is it possible that you could defend the view that it's right to believe in God, even contrary to what the balance of reasons would suggest? So I wanted to look at the options there, and whether in particular you could answer this question of what the ethics of belief in God should be before you answer the question of whether or not you have got reasons to believe in God, or more reasons to believe in God than not. So that's the purpose of the paper anyway.
So my initial response would be is that I would take the position that God exists as any other claim, and for any claim about things external to your imagination, I imagine you typically would want some kind of justification that this thing exists or is true outside of your imagination, and that would be some kind of a reason. So I would say that yes, you would probably need reasons to believe God exists if you wanted to have a consistent or rational belief, as opposed to just believing because you wanted to, which I think would be fine too. But if you wanted to have a rational belief in a God, then I think you would need to have reasons, just like you would for any claim of anything that exists outside of your imagination.
So that's the view that's in the paper. It's the first one I come across and say, look, this is a pretty sensible view. Seems as if we adopted in other areas of life. Maybe this is the view we should hold over here. And you might say, look, for anything, I mean, you said for anything you believe exists outside your imagination, you should have positive reasons before you believe in it. It's sort of it's somehow epistemically illegitimate to allow your belief to float free of evidence. You really need your belief, when it's going to be functioning in you properly, to be pushed by evidence rather than anything else. Although you yourself said you were quite sanguine about the idea that someone might say, well, I believe this because I want to, I don't have any evidence, and you didn't seem to be as averse to someone who went down that track as I would have thought you might have been. So I think that's certainly a consistent view. And I don't know that it's the wrong view, but it occurs to me it has to be pretty carefully stated, because if it's not to generate a lot of collateral damage. So I take it that probably neither of us are solipsists of the present moment, i.e., you believe that more than your current consciousness exists. You believe there's a past, there's a future. You believe you're speaking to someone else in a universe that extends beyond your immediate sensory realm.
Well, it's just me and my chair. Those are the two only real things. Everything else is.
Well, even if you let in your chair, it's still got something. And yet you might think, well, for certain versions of brain in vat hypotheses, or disembodied spirits being fooled by a malign demon, as Descartes put it, for certain versions of those skeptical scenarios, you will, I imagine, say, yeah, okay, I haven't actually got any evidence that those scenarios are false, because if you construct them in the right way, they become evidence transcendent truths. And yet I believe that they are false. I don't actually believe that it's only my mind at the moment having these thoughts that exist in reality. So I am committed then to thinking that there is something independent of my mind. I might say, well, I'm just unreasonable in that. That's just a belief that I happen to have, and I don't think it is reasonable. But I guess a lot of people would say, well, hang on, it's pretty reasonable to be the sort of person who believes that the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago with a load of false memories, to believe that others have minds, to believe a lot of things, which nevertheless in the end are beliefs for which we have no reason.
Well, my position would be is if I have some belief, like there is an external world, or that I'm a brain in a vat, and if that belief allows me to make successful novel predictions about future experiences, and they get them correct, then I'm justified in that belief either way. So if me and a solipsist are having a conversation, and we both believe in novel testable predictions of science, but he thinks it's because his hypothesis is that he's a brain in a vat or was created 5 minutes ago, but that allows him to make successful predictions, then he's justified in that belief. But I would also be justified in my belief that there's an external world, universe is 14 billion years old, et cetera, as long as those beliefs are able to make successful predictions, then your belief is justified.
Yeah, that still might sort of circumscribe things pretty tightly, because there'll be, I imagine, all sorts of beliefs that you would naturally warm to that wouldn't really be such as to yield predictions, the success or falsity of which you'll ever be in a position to judge. So you mentioned your belief that the universe is more or less 14 billion years old. That's a belief which I have too, but I'd be hard pressed to say what it is that I predict about my experience successfully on the basis of it, such that if that belief is false, and in fact Russell's 5 minute hypothesis is right, that belief is more justified than Russell's 5 minute hypothesis. So but you perhaps say, oh, that's fine if you believe in Russell's 5 minute hypothesis, precisely because, as you pointed out, it doesn't lead to any more successful predictions than 14 billion years old hypothesis. Fine, each is equally justified, because each is equally giving rise to, I mean, I don't know what positive predictions they give rise to at all, but that things will have an appearance of age about them or something, and then I look and there's at least an appearance of age. So is the 5 minute hypothesis equally justified, do you think?
Well, I don't require the falsification criterion. My criterion is simply a positive affirmation level. So if I say, I believe the universe is 13.8 billion years old, if it's 13.8 billion years old, we'll expect to see the redshift in the galaxies as we look further away.
Right, okay,
greater redshift.
Forgive me for cutting across you, but you don't sort of observe the redshift, do you? So it's not a prediction of an experience that you are going to have in the next 10 minutes that is you.
Well, I can say, if me personally want to do this, I can predict that I can find the papers and see these results, and I can literally do that. So that would also be a successful testable prediction.
Yeah. So it's more testable in principle than in practice.
Well, that would be test. Like I can test that I can go to the papers and see if I can confirm, see if these results are the ones that are expected from the papers. So I can, in that case, the testable prediction is I will see the results in the papers, not that we will see that I will see the redshift in the stars. So if my testable prediction is that the universe is 14.8 billion years old, therefore scientists measured this and therefore they wrote papers, I will then be able to see the papers and see these results, which I can do. And so my prediction that the universe is 13.8 billion years gives me an accurate ability to predict the future, in that I can personally go see the papers, and that is a confirmable result. Now, if you came to the same conclusion via you're a solipsist, or that the magical leprechaun created us 5 minutes ago and he wanted to make us believe the universe is 13.8 billion years ago, therefore he made all of this background data. If you genuinely had that belief and then tested that and went to look for the paper specifically for that reason, you could be justified in that as well. I don't have that belief. I have a different belief, and because my belief leads to the same successful testable predictions, that one is justified.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think so. I spoke a bit too hastily earlier on then, because I was suggesting that on this account it's going to really tightly circumscribe what you're reasonable in knowing. So I was thinking that you would say I believe that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and I was skeptical about what positive predictions will that lead to you to having. And I would have thought your experiences, as you predict them, with that belief, are going to be pretty similar to the experiences that will be predicted by someone on a 5-minute hypothesis. And you've pointed out that they will be, and actually I would say that the 5-minute hypothesis guy, he's as justified in believing in the 5-minute hypothesis as I am in believing 13.8 billion years, because on the 5-minute hypothesis he would predict, as I predict, that were we to go to a library and look up papers, there'd be papers which suggested the universe was 13.8 billion years old, or at least much older than 5 minutes.
Yeah, if they had a very thorough version of the 5-minute hypothesis that had entailments of all the things we see, especially if they had entailments of things we haven't discovered yet, like if they said we were created 5 minutes ago and we'll discover this new law or whatever, and we discovered that would be great justification. They'd probably be more justified than we would. But I'd say the same thing would apply to us. If we can predict things we don't know yet, assuming the universe is 14.8 billion years ago, and we discover them that they're correct, then I think that's more evidence for the 13.8 hypothesis than the leprechaun hypothesis. So if one hypothesis is able to predict new information about the universe and get it correct, that hypothesis has greater support than any other hypothesis.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I wonder what you do, just thinking about our the religious context here. I wonder what you do with sort of eschatological verification. Someone who said, you know what, I'm absolutely on board with this. You can only really say that you've got a justified belief in a thing if it leads you to make some predictions which are in principle verifiable, and verifiable not just in principle, sorry, in practice by you. There's a little bit of tightness there, actually. It's not just that it has to be in principle verifiable. You yourself have to be able to go to the relevant library and look up the papers, and you yourself would have to verify the particular religious hypothesis you were considering. What if someone says, yeah, I'm really into this sort of eschatological verification. You know, I believe that God exists and he's omnipotent and omniscient, and then they come up with all these pretty grand-sounding properties, and you think, well, I wonder what sort of predictions this is going to give rise to. If it's going to be justified, it's got to give rise to some predictions that, in principle, the person talking to me about, or in practice, the person talking to me about, can put to the test and find themselves verified by. Would you say, well, this is great, because the person says, that's fine, because in the afterlife we'll all be resurrected, and God will appear to us and say, you know what, here's my list of properties, and by doing that, verify that my beliefs were correct. So my beliefs give rise to a set of predictions which, if they're right, will be verified. So do religious beliefs of that sort come out as justified by the same token?
If they make successful predictions, yeah. So I'd say, to use the example I like the best, is that if I believe there's an all-powerful being named Yahweh, and I pray to Yahweh for a gold brick, and a gold brick appears in front of me, that's evidence of Yahweh.
It may well be. I think you'd also have to believe of this God that he's a sort of God who would answer the prayer for a gold brick by giving you a gold brick, because you might think, oh, I believe in the same God as you, but you know what, I think your pursuit of gold is really what's letting you down spiritually. So I think even though there is such a God as this, if you pray for him for a gold brick, he'll give you an iron brick just to teach you a lesson or two.
That would be evidence as well. That would also be evidence.
yeah, it would be pretty cool, wouldn't it? Okay, good. So so that's you might say, you might say, okay, my ethics of belief in God is that before you should really believe in God, you should you should be in a position where you can truly say of yourself that your belief in God is giving rise to predictions which, on the truth of the belief, will be verified by experiences that you will one day have. And then a lot of religious beliefs will come out as justified by reference to that criteria. And as long as they believe in some, as not all do, admittedly, but many of them do, some sort of post-mortem eschatological state where all these questions are answered, if by nobody else, by God himself telling you the answers.
Yeah, so if I died and went to heaven and met God, that would be phenomenal evidence.
Yeah. So I wonder that, because forgive me, I was sort of predicting you'd be more skeptical than you seem to be being. But what would you say to someone who is listening or viewing and saying, oh, okay, well, I'm pretty fundamentalist, devout, born-again Christian, I believe a lot of things which I'm pretty sure are going to be different from what you believe. Perhaps they even say, look, I believe the universe was created, it's not 5 minutes ago, but I'm a young earth creationist. I believe this stuff. I believe Adam was a historical individual and was created maybe in a garden 6,000 years BC or something. I believe this stuff. Okay, but I do believe that at the end of time, each of us will be standing before God's judgment throne, and he's going to have some things to say to you and some things to say to me. And the nature of the people who believe this is that they will anticipate he'll be saying some more critical things of you than they'll be saying to them. So they have all this view, they unpack it all. But it is true that, well, if that is true, you and you're using it to make predictions about sets of experiences you're going to have post-mortem, and sets of experiences indeed that I'm going to have post-mortem. And yeah, that is justified because it's giving rise to a set of pretty meaty predictions, which are such that if they ever unfold, you'll say, well, that's verified my view. So because that is the nature of your belief gets to count as justified now.
I would not say that. I wouldn't say it's justified now. I'd say it would be justified once you had those experiences, but prior to that, it wouldn't be justified.
But your belief that the universe is 13.8 billion years as you have it today is justified today, is it not? Even though you have not yet gone, and I predict will never go to a library and look up the papers.
Oh, I have. I've literally already done that. So that's something I
okay. Some other beliefs you have that you haven't looked up the papers on.
Well, most of my beliefs related to ontology and what exists, I have looked up the papers on. That's literally my job as a YouTuber, to go debate these things. I don't like, unless it's something I really don't care enough to look.
What about your mother's maiden name or something?
I don't even know it. So.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So like in those kinds of cases, I would say my belief probably isn't justified, but I don't care enough to want to justify it. It's not something that's important enough to me to want to justify.
Right. Okay. So it's not that it's that you actually, to be justified, you have to have had a belief which gave rise to a prediction which you have yourself already checked.
Yes.
Okay, right. Okay, so that's I hadn't realised that. I thought that forward-lookingness was enough, as long as it gives rise to a prediction. And indeed, as I initially put it back to you, it was that it could in principle be checked. Whether you in practice could check it or not didn't seem to me germane. But you said, oh no, it has to be testable in practice by you. But it actually, if I'm right in saying it, now it has to be not just testable in practice by you, but have been tested in practice by you. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Good.
Or at least you have some false memories that they did this, in which case it's
so there's going to be a sort of circularity here, isn't there? That your belief in the reliability of your own memory about what you've done to check your other beliefs has to be justified. Does it by having done a memory test recently? Having gone to a doctor and he says you've got one of the best memories I've ever looked at. But then you've only got a memory now of having, or an apparent memory, to avoid begging the question, of having been to a doctor. I wonder how that's going to unpack in the end, whether it's going to work.
Well, the problem of memory justification, I think, is one of the fundamental problems in epistemology. I don't think anybody's solved that one yet. But essentially, It's like Agrippa's trilemma, something that's so fundamental that is not really solvable in some sense.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So what if I say, okay, here's another view. This is a view I put in the paper. I say it's going to be hard to maintain that for every belief you have, if you're going to be reasonable in holding that belief, you have to have something which you take to be a reason for it. And I think this would be germane to your point of view, because it looks as if, although I haven't fully felt my way around the edges of all of this successfully yet, so maybe I've misjudged it a little bit. Not for the first time this afternoon, but it looks as if you're saying, look, I don't actually have any beliefs for which I have not checked them by reference to some evidence that a prediction that the beliefs being true would give rise to has in fact been satisfied.
Oh, I have a number of beliefs.
Sorry, not that I don't have any beliefs, but I don't count them as knowledge or as epistemically justified.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a kind of you believe all sorts of things, we all do. But the things you count as meeting the standard of epistemically justified.
So just to give an example, I believe I am the smartest, most attractive man in the world, but it's not a justified belief.
Yeah, and I wouldn't wish to claim whether it was true or false, but okay, I've got you. So here I say, okay, it's going to be hard to say that, in order to be justified, any belief has to have some other belief which you take to, and correctly take to be evidence in favor of the truth of the belief that it's justifying. So in order for you to be justified in believing that the universe is 13.8 billion years ago old, you have to have the belief that you yourself have read relevant scientific papers which have reliably told you that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Otherwise, your belief that the universe is 13.8 billion years old just cannot be a justified belief, because there is no other belief to which you can refer which gives you a reason for holding the belief that we're asking ourselves about the justification of. So that sort of principle, that in order to be justified in believing that P, there has to be some other belief to which you can refer, which is your reason for believing that P, is going to make it hard to sort of, there's going to be an infinite regress problem. And you might say, that's okay, because I'm just talking about what it is to justify, and you can build this castle in a cloud, if you like. As long as you've got a justification for the belief that P in terms of belief at Q, you don't need a justification of Q for that to be an overall justificatory chain. You just need to go one step back. But it's going to be tempting to think that the principle that you had in mind that led you to think that before you can be reasonable in believing that P, you has to be something you take to be your reason for believing that P. Let's call it believing that Q. It's going to be hard not to think that the rationale behind thinking that way isn't going to extend infinitely, and hence make a justified belief impossible for anyone who's incapable of an infinite number of beliefs. So,
right, so I'm a foundationalist.
I put that very clearly, but go ahead.
I totally understand. You're asking the grounding problem, which is Agrippa's trilemma. I don't do infinite regress. I'm a foundationalist, so I have a foundational experience that I ground my beliefs in. So I start off with, I think, therefore I am, which isn't actually an argument. It's just a description. I have an experience. It's a thing. It's like a rock. It's a thing that exists. And from that, I have things that I see, camera, TV, whatever. And so whatever my experience is entails these classifications. And from that, my beliefs form. So there's things that are actually existing that are occurring, which are not beliefs. They're an actual thing. And from that, beliefs form. And then the beliefs are just, these are initial beliefs are justified by the experience. And then from those initial beliefs, you build on greater complexity levels of beliefs. So there's some difference between my imagination and my experience. That would be like one of the first order set of beliefs. Logic, math, those would be the first order set of beliefs. And then you want some method to differentiate your imagination from reality. And once you get that, you get to the second order set of beliefs, which is more like the science level stuff. And that's where you get multiverse level beliefs. And so as long as you can take your higher order level beliefs, the world is 13.8 billion years ago, and that connects to the scientific papers, which connects to your personal experience, which is also at the first order beliefs of logic and things, then you can have a justified change starting with this foundationalist position of the cogito, I think, therefore I am.
Good. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good. No, I think I do understand it a bit more clearly now. So this is actually quite close then to the, in the paper that the link is to, I say, okay, so you might have this idea that before you can before you can be appropriately believe in God, you have to have something which you take to be reason or evidence to believe in God, because you ought not to believe in the existence of a thing unless you've got some reasons for it. That's view one. View second is that the second view, which is moved on to a little bit in the paper as a result of saying, well, it's going to be very hard to unpack this in a way that doesn't cause too much collateral damage, i.e., you might be aiming to knock out the rationality of belief in God with this type of principle and maneuver, but you're going to knock out the rationality of believing in a whole host of things. So let's see how we can precisify the principle a bit more to be a bit more targeted on the God belief. Not really going to clearly work in a non-question begging way. Okay, let's move on to consider the idea that you might have been driven to anyway by some of the arguments against the first view, the grounding view, problem, as you put it, when I gave it out to you. Okay, that might say, well, some beliefs we can be reasonable in, so we can be appropriate in having. I don't want to use the word reasonable just because I think we can be reasonable people in having beliefs for which we have no reasons. And so it's a little bit hard then to articulate that thought if I'm using the word reasonable and reasons around the place. So I think it can be permissible to believe a thing, even though you have no reasons for the believing of that thing. And then that would be, in your case, you'd say, oh yeah, that's that. I believe that because whatever I believe foundationally, I accept. I have no reasons for believing whatever it is I believe foundationally. So I might have an
issue with that because I say, like, What I believe foundationally are beliefs describing my experience, and I do have a reason to believe those, which is I'm having the experience, but that's not a belief. I don't have a belief I'm having the experience. I'm
Yeah,
literally having the experience. And so I think
yeah,
the foundation here isn't a belief. The foundation is an experience, and that experience is what grounds all the further beliefs.
right. So where would we get to the first belief? Suppose you have an experience of a red patch in your visual field. So that's not a belief. That's just an experience you're having.
Mhm.
But your first belief would be something like, oh, I seem to be seeing a red patch. Would it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Good. And that would be a belief for which would the experience be a reason? It wouldn't be a reason that, oh yeah, it would. You'd saying, oh, the experience as if of seeing a red patch is my reason for forming the belief that I see. Okay, yeah. Okay, great. So that's fine. Then it's a ground or reason. I might have been a bit restrictive in saying, look, I think for reasons you need to have, you know, beliefs can be reasons for other beliefs and so on. But sure, I'd accept that. That's that. Oh, okay. Why stipulate that? Why not say this data is really good reason for us to believe that smoking causes cancer? The thing you've pointed to, this data is not a set of beliefs. It's a sort of, you know, some, you know, curve or something on a piece of paper. And yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah, yeah. Your experience is something. So, but so whatever you take as your foundational beliefs, they're not things for which you have reasons of a sort which can be articulated as other beliefs that you have. So that you can't sort of say, well, it, this is what I that you have had an experience as if of a red patch is your reason for you believing that you've had a red patch. But when someone says to you, "Oh, what reason do I have to believe that you've seen a red patch?" That's not a thing to which uh, uh, you can't expect that thing to be for them a reason to believe that you've seen a red patch. You can say, well, that it seems to me as if I've seen a red patch. Surely that's a good reason for you to believe that I probably have seen a red patch, because I'm the sort of person to whom it wouldn't seem that they'd seen a red patch unless they had seen a red patch.
Right. So for them, from their perspective, they wouldn't be able
Yeah,
to use the same first order experience as a
yeah,
justification for my beliefs. They would have to go into some second order level of saying, well, I start with the same personal experience. Or I start with a personal experience. There's some difference between my imagination and reality. That person meets the criterion for being a part of the reality, not the imagination. And from that, I can then infer that they have experiences analogous to mine. And then from that, I can
yeah,
infer they probably saw a red patch. So you can make like an inductive second, third order argument for why you should be justified in believing they saw a red patch, but their personal experience would not be a justification for you to believe that they did.
yeah, yeah. Good. So what do you say again? Just thinking about the religious context. Suppose someone says, "Oh, well, I'm actually quite taken by this view, and I want to apply it over to the religious context." And so they say, "Well, I believe that God exists," and you say, "Oh, you know, what are your reasons for that?" And they say, "Oh, but you know, I've had an experience of God, you know, speaking to me, or maybe it's not quite as dramatic as that, you know, just God's presence in my life or something." So they say something a little bit vaguer than that. But anyway, they take themselves, you know, as far as you can tell, they're sincere. They take themselves to have had an experience which grounds appropriately their belief that God exists. They say, you know, is that a reason for you to believe that God exists? Is your experience a reason? They might say, yeah, yeah, sure, in that sense that, you know, data can be a reason for thinking that smoking causes cancer. Your sensory experiences, you know, of a red patch are a reason for you to think, oh, there's something red out there, or initially to think, as you have it, that I'm seeing a red patch, and then to infer, oh, there's something red out there, or there's probably something red out
Well,
there.
I think you
Yeah,
made a
sure.
leap there. So I want to clarify when I say I have an experience, I saw a red patch. That doesn't justify that there is actually a red patch there. That just justifies I had an experience there's a red patch. It could just be a delusion. So I don't know whether or not the red patch actually exists or if it's just a figment of my imagination. But I do have a justification for a belief that I had this experience that I saw a red patch. And
Yeah,
then if you want to go further than that and say I have a justification to believe there is actually a red patch there independent of my imagination, that would be a second order thing. So you need some kind of methodology where you could recognize that there's some difference between the things you're seeing and the things you're imagining. Like I can imagine a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn. So there's some
yeah,
difference between these two classes of things. And you need some methodology to filter out different things you experience into which one of the classes they fit into. And once you have that methodology and you can apply it to the red patch and whichever side it lands on, then you would be justified in believing there is actually a red patch independent of your experience. So if you just had an experience of God, you'd have to do the same thing and say, I need some methodology that I can use to put God in the category of imaginary things or real external things. And once you apply God to this methodology, which would be the justification we're talking about, the evidence, then you could be justified in saying God exists. But the direct experience itself would not be sufficient, in the same reason it wouldn't be sufficient for just seeing the red paper, because you haven't applied this methodology to differentiate, is it one of the real things or the imaginary things?
Yeah, but I mean, this is in some idealized form, I suppose, because most of the time it seems to me as if I'm seeing a red patch, I don't actually deploy any conscious methodology to get from that experience to the belief that there's a red object in my line of sight. The belief that there's a red object in my line of sight occurs instantly in response to that stimulus. There's no reasoning from the stimulus to the belief that there's a red object. The belief the red object appears.
I don't know if I would agree with that, because I think that you have a reliable methodology you have used for many years where you have seen things and thought they were there and were then able to make successful future predictions about how you were going to interact with those things. So I see a cup. I think I'm thirsty. I can drink from the cup. I drink from the cup. So it makes novel testable predictions. My sensory information and making differentiation between imaginary things and real things, whatever method I'm using, has had years of successful predictions. And so if I'm applying that same methodology, which I already have justification for, to this particular example of the red sheet or God or whatever, then you could be justified because you have already established this is here's a successful methodology that makes successful predictions, and I'm applying the same thing, which is now my evidence, to the case of the red sheet. But in many cases, there are people who do have I forget what it's called, the different kinds of delusion disorders, where they see something and they don't have that same confidence because they know they can't interact with that same thing with the same level of confidence that you can, because of many of the delusions they have don't lead to the expected predictions that they would expect given their life experiences. And so in this case, you would still be using the same thing, but your methodology here would be your past experience of using your eyes to differentiate real things from imaginary things and interact with them in a future testable way.
Yeah, good. So what would you say to someone who said, I mean, they may not agree with all the details, but they say, okay, I'm not too far adrift from you, really. And I'm using what seems to me to be the case as my evidence of what really is the case. So this is a methodology which I have applied successfully in all sorts of areas of life. I take what seems to me to be the case to be prima facie defeasible, but prima facie evidence of what is the case. If it seems to me that this is, there's a red patch over there, I take that as some reason for me to believe that the red patch really is over there. Not got perfect eyesight. Sometimes I see things in odd colors, but unless I've got special considerations obtaining, which give me reasons to doubt that what seems to me to be the case is the case, my principal methodology is to deploy this thing, call it, if you like, the principle of credulity. What seems to you to be the case is good evidence for you of what is the case. I do indeed enjoy employing that in everyday life, and indeed I couldn't really get on without it, because otherwise I would be locked in some sort of solipsism of the present moment or something worse. So okay, that's my view. And then I've applied it over here in the case of my religious experience. It seemed to me as if God was speaking to me, so I believe that there probably is a God who's speaking to me. Would that be all right?
The prima facie thing I might agree with, but I'd say that we do have defeaters for that. So I'd ask the question: are you human? Do you have one of those human brain thingies? Which has?
And they say I don't know. I haven't looked inside my head yet, so it's something I haven't actually tested.
I would say I would make it.
I haven't actually conducted the experiment, which you would say you really ought to have done before you can be justified in believing that you've got a brain inside your head. But let's suppose I open a little hole in it, shine a mirror in, screw that little thing back on, and say, "Great, good news! I seem to have one." Yeah.
Well, so I'd say that it seems like we have lots of examples of human brains making stuff up on lots of occasions. Like there's actually a condition where people see leprechauns. People have anthropocentric fallacies. They see ghosts, imagine gods, all kinds of things when they're not there. So we know that there's a lot of fallacious holes in human reasoning, And if these
Yeah.
fallacious holes could explain the experience, then there seems to be more justification to believe those are the cause than you actually speaking to a God. And
Yeah.
does the methodology you are using have a way to filter those out or differentiate those
Yeah.
as a part of your way to differentiate imagination from reality? Because if it doesn't, it seems like your methodology is insufficient to justify belief in the God in that case. If your methodology does have a way to filter those out, or at least to some degree, then you would be justified in believing in a God. So, like the novel testable predictions case, this is why I use novel testable predictions, because delusions are very bad at doing that, very bad at predicting the future. But if God told you where the buried treasure was or something, and you became a millionaire, or what the next lottery numbers were, and you got it right, that would be great evidence. That would be a phenomenal way to differentiate all of these fallacies in the human mind with
Yeah.
the God belief. But that would be my criterion. There is I would need to see in your methodology, do you have a way to filter out those human fallacies and biases that we know about that would be defeaters for it on its own? And have you applied those to this case?
Yeah. And suppose they say, "Oh yeah, it's all right. I've done that." So they say, "Well, like, oh yeah, yeah, oh indeed." So it seems to me as if God was telling me to, I don't know, give a bit more money to a worthy charity, and so I believe that on the basis of this seeming that God's probably telling me to give a bit more money to some worthy charity. I'm absolutely, of course, aware that it seemed to. There was a serial killer in the UK who may not be known to you. Peter Sutcliffe was a serial killer in the 70s. He killed a lot of women, and it's unclear, but it's pretty. But it seems as if he believed that God was telling him to do this. It seems as if he sincerely believed that God was telling him to do this. And so, okay, well, God wasn't telling him to do this. So his seeming wasn't an accurate representation of God's will for him. You say, oh, it seems as if you're differentiating between your experience as if of God telling you to do a thing, viz. Give some money to charity, and Peter Sutcliffe's experience as if of God telling him to do something, viz. Kill a load of women in the north of England, which is where he was operating. So on what basis are you making that discrimination? I say, oh, well, yeah, I've got to think about what sort of thing is it which, were there to be a God, he'd be likely to want me to do or want Peter Sutcliffe to do. And by those criteria, it seems pretty clear that God wouldn't want me, or indeed Peter Sutcliffe, to murder people. Doesn't seem at all clear that God wouldn't want me or other people indeed to give more money to this particular worthy charity. So I've got a methodology. I have deployed it. My experience has fallen on the right side of the line. Peter Sutcliffe's has fallen on the wrong side. But it's not that all things have to fall on the right side. It does make discriminations. I've made one right there. If I woke up tomorrow and it seemed to me that God was telling me to murder a lot of people, I think, oh, okay, that's probably not God speaking to me anymore. And yeah, that hasn't yet happened. So far, it's looking good for my religious experiences, tracking what's going on. So is that all right, as it were? You think, oh, okay, well, fine. You've got some methodology. You've deployed it. I asked you for something. You've given it to me. I haven't got any more complaints. I bet you have got more complaints.
Yes, quite a few. That one is literally one of the examples of one of those big fallacies that I think are endemic in human minds that we know about, which is when you think about God and anthropocentric beings, you're normally reflecting your own intuition, and so your intuition would tell you that God would have a particular nature, but the murderer's intuition would tell him that God has the exact opposite potential nature. And so, using that same methodology, both of you would be justified. Even and if we know one of you is false in this case, then that methodology is clearly not a good methodology. And so we need some different methodology that is able to accurately filter out this particular human bias. And the methodology presented does not seem to be able to do that. And so I would suggest novel testable predictions would be a better methodology because it can do it.
Yes, yeah. So I think it's an interesting point to make for sure, and it's definitely cogent. So I was assuming a certain sort of value objectivism, regardless of my religious beliefs. It would have been clear to me that it would be bad to murder people. It would be good for more money to be given to this charity. And then my religious experiences came in and told me that, yeah, you know what, and God would like you in particular to give money to this charity that you'd in some sort of, non-person affecting way realised it would be good worth some money to be given to. And then I've said, oh, okay, so I probably better get on and give the money to the charity, whereas previously I hadn't realised, well, I thought it would be good, but I didn't think it was my duty to give money to that charity. There's all sorts of charities it would be good to give money to. So there's a certain sort of value objectivism built into the model here. And
I'd say that if we can assume morality is objective and include that in the part of the argument, but I think you would still need some justification that if God existed, he would be good. And if you didn't have that justification, I think it would be begging the question to assume if God was talking to you, he would expect you to give to charity as opposed to murder people. And
Yes.
so I still don't think that would count as a justification until you provided some independent reason to believe that if God existed, he must be good.
Yes. Yes. So you could, yeah. So there are some arguments. If you do say, well, it is morality is objective. Are we going to allow that if God existed, he'd be omniscient and omnipotent? Because from there we might be able to get to him being of necessity perfectly good as well. Might be able to derive perfect goodness from omnipotence and omniscience, given objectivism. Or you're going to say, yeah, maybe you will, but I'm going to start saying, why assume he's omniscient? Why assume he's omnipotent?
Well, I don't think either of those are logically possible, but we can grant that for the sake of the argument. Let's say he is both omniscient and omnipotent, and how would you get perfectly good from that? Because I can imagine a God who knows everything and is all powerful, but who just mass murders people for fun. I'd call him the Christian God, but besides,
you call him the
Christian God, drowns babies.
You just sort of said that under your breath. Maybe you were trying to avoid my blushes or spare my feelings or something. Didn't catch it. Yeah. So I get the point. So okay, I suppose. So for me, I think it's if a being it knows what it is that it would all things be considered best to do, and has enough power to do that thing, there would be no explanation for that being not doing what was all things considered the best thing to do, and hence being perfect. You point out that, well, maybe this being would be psychologically constituted to get fun out of deviating from what he had all things considered best reason to do, and that's I think that we need to look at it in a bit more detail. But I would have thought at least one point to make is that sounds more complicated, because he's now a being with a certain psychology rather than one about whom you've had to say nothing about his psychology other than that it isn't complicated, in that he gets fun out of doing things which he knows of himself he's got less reason to do than the other things which he could have done. So there maybe it's logically possible that there could be such a being, but it strikes us as more complicated and probably
I'm not sure how that would be. I'm not sure how that would be more complicated, because in this case, if we think perfect goodness or whatever, if there is a God, by God would mean something that created literally everything else. It's like a necessary being of some kind. Then perfect goodness would be either something in God's nature, or it would be something God created. If it's in God's nature, then whatever God's nature is would be good. And so the best he could achieve would be whatever he finds is fun, murdering babies or whatever. That would just be goodness, if his nature is the definition of what perfect goodness is, or what the perfect universe would be. If God created goodness, there could be an evil God who created a moral law that is Buddhism or Jainism or some really good moral law, but then his own nature contravenes on that and he wants to do different things. But because he's the creator, he has the authority to do that, because the objective morality doesn't apply to him in some sense. And so either case, I think, would be equally as simple as saying God has a moral nature which he then reflects in the universe with some moral law, or that he has a moral nature and created a alternative universe that violates that, like the problem of evil. And so I don't see why that would be any simpler than saying there is a God who we would define as evil, but either manipulated the universe to have a different law that applies to us, which again is what I think many Christians believe, or that goodness is simply defined by his nature, in which case him murdering babies or whatever is actually good. And so he did create the maximally perfect universe, and then was evil.
Well, so I think lots of moving parts there. Let's just to keep it simple for me, let's assume a Platonist. So we're not thinking that God, in some Occamist, totally voluntarist way, can spit out any old set of moral principles he likes, but rather that he finds himself in a pre-existing set of moral structures to which he can choose whether or not to conform. Now, that won't be acceptable to everyone, but at least then there will be a very robust sense in which morality is objective. It's independent of anything even God might think or feel about it, and that he knows about those things in virtue of his omniscience. So his knowing about that will be his knowing what it is which he has overall most reason to do. His power, or if he's omnipotent, he'll have enough power to do that which is overall he has most reason to do. So if he's going to act unreasonably, despite knowing what he has most reason to do and being able to do it, that seems to me to require in him something more complex. There's got to be something about his psychology which is such as to mean that he's not always, and in this case won't be, driven by what he has reason to do, but must be driven by something else. And that then makes it seem to me a more complex hypothesis. I agree it gets more complex still if you say, okay, let's not assume this Platonism. Let's suppose we go to the...
Well, before we get lost, I want to try to... So I think it would be equally as simple to say God would disobey this law. Say there is this objective Platonic morality God is subject to. He knows it's there. To say that he would act on it, I think would be equally as complex to say he would act against it. Both of those would require some kind of a motivation psychologically. And I think that motivation, regardless of which direction it goes, would be equally as complex. Because I don't think, unless God has some kind of psychological motivation to act for or against it, the neutral is he would just do nothing. And so it would be equally as complex to say he'd go against it as it would to say he would move towards it.
Right, because I was thinking that you can do a good thing just because you realize it's good, whereas you can't do a bad thing just because you realize it's bad. You have to have more going on, so it's going to be more. If God sort of looked at it and think, okay, I could either, I suppose he's great at everything, and now he's thinking, right, I'm going to interact with this universe. I can either do this, which would be the thing, the doing of which would be perfect, or I can do this, which would be the doing of which would be less than perfect. He can say, oh well, if I do this, my reason can simply be that that's good. That would be to be good. If I do that, it's got to be that, well, even though it wouldn't be good, it would be this, and I quite fancy doing that, so therefore I'll do that. So it would always be more complex in virtue of this asymmetry between being able to do a thing simply because you think of it that it's good, and not being able to do a thing simply because you think of it as bad.
I don't see that as more complex in this case, because I think if the recognition that something is good would be more like a calculator recognizing 1 + 1 = 2, but I think it would need some kind of a motivation to say I will then therefore do this. Or so even if there is some intrinsic reason to do it in the recognition, unless that reason is motivating to the being, then it won't act on it any more likely than it has some other reason to act against it. And so I think that the recognition on its own wouldn't give a justification for the being to act one way or the other, even if you wanted to count that as a reason to be moral, until there is some psychological motivation in the being to act one way or the other, it wouldn't make it do anything.
I was assuming that knowledge of the good motivated in itself. You didn't need to have a desire. So you might not think that's generally true, and hence why I think it would be true of God if it's not true of us. I think it's true of us as well as would be true of God. What could I do to motivate that thought? Maybe. Well, maybe phenomenologically is that, I might say, the other day, one of my colleagues here at work who I really dislike, and I find myself sometimes idly fantasizing that they fall under a bus or something horrible had happened to them, and having to catch myself and try to stop that. They really dislike this person. But anyway, they needed some help with something, and I realized that I could, at very minimal cost to myself, help them out. And so I realized that I really ought to help them out. And that realization that I ought to help them out, is what I acted on in the end. I did help them out, and I have to admit, though, I was slightly through gritted teeth, and because my desires were certainly not to help them out. My desire was to just sort of, let them stew in this mess of their own creation, because for some reason I've taken this, dislike to them. But anyway, I should have shoved all my desires to one side and did what I knew I ought to do because it was what I ought to do. Now, sometimes we have experiences of that sort, do we not, where we do what we ought to do because we just realize, well, that's what I ought to do. We don't have to cycle back through whether or not we want to do what we ought to do.
I don't think so. I think any
Okay.
occurrence of doing something that is moral to someone you don't like is definitely conflicting emotions, but I think that their emotion to help them is caused by usually societal expectations, biological emotional drives. I don't think it's simply because of your recognition that it's moral has some kind of oughtness entailed in it. I think
Yeah.
it's always because there's some underlying reason of your psychology motivating you to do that, because I think the exact same thing when experienced by a psychopath or a sociopath does not in any way cause any motivation whatsoever to do any moral anything. And so it seems like that is a subjective reason that applies to your psychology that I would also expect must be required of God. I don't think oughtness in and of itself has any motivational factors on minds whatsoever.
Yeah. So yeah, and I was assuming that this example doesn't persuade you. If you're, is it the same in logic as well? Suppose you're trying to teach some child logic, and you were saying, look, if you believe that P and you believe that P implies Q, you really ought to believe that Q, and or something a little bit more complex, some proof of something that's a little bit, given this, you ought to be writing this down now, something that wouldn't be, if the child says, well, you say that I ought to believe this, but frankly, I don't desire anything the believing of this will facilitate. So, I've got no skin in this game, thanks. There's no requirement to reason logically if reasoning logically won't get you more of what you want out of the world.
Yeah, so from my research in neurology, when the emotional part of the brain is damaged, you also lose the ability to do logical thinking and rationality. And so from that, I think it's more rational to infer that, like, if you give 1 + 1 to this person, they're not going to be able to infer 2 is the correct or what you ought to believe unless they already have some kind of a motivation psychologically to give them a drive to lean that direction. Otherwise, they're essentially just blank slates. And I think the same thing would apply to moral reasoning and to God in this case, that if he didn't have some psychology to prioritize logical reasoning or moral reasoning, I don't think he would.
Yeah. So because I was hoping, and you didn't bite this, so I can't reel you in on it. But I was hoping you'd say, "Oh no, okay, so if you believe that P and you believe that P implies Q, you ought to believe Q." And whether you want to believe Q, whether believing that Q is convenient for your life or not, is a consideration. But it's not the consideration which is what generates, when it's present, the normative force of the claim that if you believe that P and you believe that P implies Q, then you ought to believe Q. Maybe Q is the sort of thing that you'd really wish was false, and that it would be quite convenient for you to be false, and that believing that it was false would actually make you happier, and you'd never come up against any recalcitrant experience which shoved your face in the fact that you believe a falsehood. Sure. But nevertheless, if you do believe that P and you do believe that P implies Q, then logic dictates that you ought to, regardless of your desires, you ought to believe that Q. So I was hoping you'd come up with that sort of answer, because then I go, right now we're off to the races, and we can do what we can do. And I can see, okay, as I say, okay, I should give up on this because you're not bitten that fish, so, or whatever it is you put on the end of the line to try and catch a fish, bit of bait. So I can't wheel you in on it. So fair enough. But in this context, back to the religious epistemology topic, though, you might say this is going to be good news for a certain other sort of person who has a different ethics of belief in God. They might say something like, well, I really want there to be a God, and it gives me a sense of it's a bit, it might sort of be, it's a bit like believing that Santa Claus exists. It'd be great if Santa Claus exists. All the presents, and there's someone at the North Pole who cares about you, and delivers presents. I love it. That would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Be wonderful being in a world where, And you say, well, maybe it would be, but I can't really, motivate myself to believe that Santa Claus exists. But sure, if I did, I'd be a happier person. And they say, I take that attitude about my belief in God. I don't actually have any reasons. It's to believe in God, and maybe you've got some good reasons to, or I don't know if you call them good reasons, but anyway, maybe the problem of evil presents me with things which I would have said were, maybe they even say the logical problem of evil works. They say this is a logically sound argument for the non-existence of God, the problem of evil. But I don't actually incline to infer the conclusion, which is logically compelled on me, given that I accept the premises and the validity of the argument, i.e., and I tell you, it's a sound argument. I think I don't actually go on to accept the conclusion of this problem of evil. Because why not? That's you've just said there's a logically sound argument from evil to the non-existence of God. But I just don't like believing that there's not a God. My God belief shapes my life in all sorts of ways that are very amenable to my happiness. And are you going to really say? I don't think you will. Are you really going to say, well, that's fine then, because there's no normativity in any argument against the existence of God, which should compel you to believe the conclusions, regardless of how discomforting you would find the conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that if you have a desire, so I think I like hypothetical imperatives. I think those are a more accurate description as opposed to categorical ones. So I would say that if someone has a hypothetical imperative that they want to be rational and they want to have rational justifications, then they ought to have reasons. But if they have a hypothetical imperative, I just want to feel good, then totally fine. Just believe whatever makes you feel good. I think that goes back to my claim that I believe I am the smartest, most attractive man on the planet. That isn't a justified belief. It just makes me feel good. So I think it's perfectly fine if you simply want to feel good and that is your reason, but that is technically a reason too. But I think if, like most people, you have some kind of, you want to be rational and believe in God, then I think that requires reasons.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. So there is the third view in this paper that I've been touching on now and again. The third view I talk about is the view that you've just said, oh, I'd be perfectly fine. Most people aren't like that. Most people want to have reasons and so on and so on. But if you really are absolutely psychologically content with your irrationality, it's not simply that I won't be able to disprove you by argument, or because that would be true, but it's that I actually haven't got anything normatively to say against you. It's not that you are failing by reference to a standard to which we should all subscribe. There is no standard to which we should all subscribe. There's only the standards for each of us individually, driven by the desires we happen to have. You are meeting the standard that's given to you by the desires you happen to have. So I've got nothing to say against you. That's very close to the view that the person who endorses the third view I talk about in the paper would be very happy with. But to a lot of people, that will seem, well, we need to be able to say something against these people, which isn't simply that they are atypical in not having the desire to be rational. We need to be able to say that, not only are they atypical in not having the desire to be rational, but they're irrational in not having the desire to be rational. They really ought to have the desire to be rational. And then that does, when you said, oh, I'm quite keen on hypothetical imperatives, and I thought, I bet you are. I bet you're not very keen on categorical imperatives, because it's the categorical judgment that regardless of what this person wants, or whether as a matter of fact, given what they want, this way of life will give them more of what they want than any other way of life to which they could switch. They have reasons to swap their ways of life to this way of life, where they start caring about being reasonable. And they've just shown themselves to be beyond the pale in that respect. So you're sort of interestingly a lot less judgmental of these people than I'm inclined to be myself.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that I think they are being perfectly rational, because I'd say that if they have a desire to be irrational because it makes them happier to believe God exists, then it's perfectly rational to reject rationality for the sake of your happiness. So, from my rational perspective, I wouldn't say they're being irrational. I'd say they're being perfectly rational because they're trying to maximize their happiness. Now, they may be failing at doing so because there may be some greater knowledge they can have through rationality that may lead to greater happiness or whatever. But without the ability to innately like pound that knowledge into their brain so they know it, then they're being perfectly rational to pursue the greatest happiness they are aware of, which is the belief in an irrational thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Good. I just want to say, the screen has frozen. I can hear you perfectly. Have I frozen from your point of view?
Nope, I can still see you. We're fine on my
And I'm
end.
moving around.
Yep.
Oh, okay, right. Well, not that I'm particularly better moving around than I am stationary, but at least that gives me, some hope that it's just something on my side of the screen rather than it's going to be affecting other people's quality of experience, whatever that is. Yeah, good. Sorry, but then being distracted by this technology meant I'd rather drop the thread. But sorry, what was the point we should now talk about?
Oh yeah. So I was saying that I would be perfectly. I think that the people who are being irrational are actually rational for doing so, because if they are rejecting rationality for some belief in a God that makes them happier, then they are
Yeah,
rationally pursuing the greatest thing that they know of that can give them happiness. And
yeah,
even if we know that adopting rationality can lead to some greater happiness in the future, unless we
yeah,
can put that information into their brains somehow, then they are technically pursuing the thing that that has the most evidence that they know of to achieve their happiness, which is their belief. In which case, they're rationally pursuing their greatest interest, which is the
yeah.
happiness, by
And
rejecting
they might
rationality.
also say look, I don't really care about evidence. So you might say, can I please pop this belief into your head? Because I think that if I pop this belief into your head, given that you desire happiness, you'll start desiring to do things which are slightly different from what at the moment you desire to do. They might say, well, that would be if I cared about having my beliefs shaped by evidence, and in fact, I don't. What was it that someone was we're fed up with the fact-based community. Do you know what I mean? There was some little trope
Mm-mm.
from I'm not connecting that quite or quoting him quite right, but you could come across someone who whatever you pop into their head by way of what you take to be evidence, given what they even given what they desire for them to change their mind, they don't desire to take that sort of thing as the evidence that you thought it was, and that indeed I would say it objectively was. We give it, and so they just stay doing what you wish they could stop doing.
Well, I
Yeah,
still see that as consistent because if they have
yeah.
some
So I
belief
think it is
that
consistent. Yeah.
the one part I think would be interesting is if they already had the knowledge in their brain that being rational could make them happier, but they chose to reject that to believe in something irrational.
Yeah.
That would be the one thing that I would see as potentially contradictory, but I'd still say that have to have some kind of a reason determining that. And that reason is going to be some emotion or justification inside of
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah. So they could just say, "Oh, I don't care about inconsistency. I don't desire to be more consistent than I am. So even if there is some contradiction in their beliefs, they might just not desire to remove it. Um, we we might all put ourselves in that position. If I say, look, this is a brilliant book about this period of history, and it's 99.9% accurate. But in fact, between one chapter and another, there's one particular date which he gives inconsistently. But you'll be so swept up in this, you won't notice this when it happens. And most of this book is fully accurate about the period. You might say, "Oh, I'm going to tolerate that. I'm going to end up believing two inconsistent things about a thing, but I'm going to believe so much good stuff about the thing that it's if you tell me this is still the best book despite its inconsistency and that it will generate in me an inconsistent pair of beliefs, I just don't care about that particular inconsistency enough to stop me wanting to read the book, because I really want to know a lot about history and this period of history, and you've told me that this is the go-to book for it. And this person just takes that slightly sanguine attitude towards what you and I think would both think are slightly more important issues, where they shouldn't be so sanguine about being inconsistent. But I say shouldn't be so sanguine. You would say, well, whether or not they should or shouldn't be sanguine depends on what their structure of desires is.
Well, yeah. So I would go further and say, let's say that they're a diletheist or believe in a paraconsistent logic where there can
Yeah,
be
I
true
hadn't even thought about
contradictions.
that. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
But let's say they could, um, they may have that as their methodology. So they start with the same thing we do as direct experience cogito, and then they apply this inconsistent logic as their first belief. Instead of us applying logical structures, standard logic, they apply these inconsistent logics.
yeah,
Um, and if that in some way works for them as their justification to understand things, then they would be perfectly justified in adopting a non-standard logic, and from
yeah,
that believing in God or whatever, even if it wasn't
yeah,
rational.
yeah. Yeah, and certainly not by classical logic. And I guess if you believe in some of these weird logics, they could say, look, I'm perfectly rational in believing that God exists and in believing that God doesn't exist at the same time. So,
Yeah.
so okay, I really do
Oh,
start
and
losing
I would not
track
say
of
that
what
they
it is
are
they are
wrong.
believing if they say things like that. But all
Yeah,
right,
and
yes,
I
okay,
wanted to say one more thing. I wouldn't say they are normatively wrong in doing that. I wouldn't say that some person adopting a diletheistic logic would be in any way objectively worse than me or you
mm,
or somebody else.
yeah,
I think that their beliefs would objectively not as correspond to reality. Probably, I hope so. But I wouldn't say that they have some kind of normative obligation that they should adopt a different logic.
yeah, yeah. So I think probably oh, they should. I'm more of a fan. I'm not fully paid up Kantian, but I'm more of a fan of categorical imperatives than you are. I think they form a part of our reasoning makeup. You don't have to all trace it back to hypothetical imperatives. So in that great debate between Hume and Kant, I think there's more to be said for Kant than you would. You'd be quite content that Hume, I think, had said all that needed to be said about the matter, and fair enough. Um, and in the paper, I do assume that, though. Right? So I'm the view that you don't hold. So to set it up, I do assume that. Well, it it I think that we should all be assuming that there is a right ethics of belief in God for if you like, for all of us. Now we might need to modulate that a little bit later on, but either it is the case that really everybody ought to have good evidence to believe in God before they believe in it, or it's the case that it's permissible to believe in God even if you don't have good evidence in favor, as long as you don't have evidence against. Or, and this is the view that I actually think you can kick out, even though the first two views, I think it's very hard to come up with non-question begging ways of arguing in favor of one or the other. But the third view is the irrationalist one that, oh, you should believe in God, or it's perfectly permissible to believe in God, even if you've got heaps of evidence against, because faith is a leap and you can leap into the absurd or something. So the third view I consider, but then kick out. But the first two views, as I cast them, are both premised on the idea that there is a right answer to this, which is right independent of what you happen to desire. It's not necessarily right independent of who you are, but it is right independent of what you happen to desire. And so I think you would find, if you read the paper, maybe you have read the paper, you would find that this is a little bit strange, because for you, the right ethics of belief, the right way to formulate your beliefs, to try and structure your beliefs, to try to update your beliefs in the light of what you take to be new evidence, this is all a function for you of what it is, the doing of which with your beliefs will satisfy the desires you happen to have. Whereas for me, that is a part of it, but it's not the whole part. And it's not actually even the main part. So there's pragmatic encroachment, but there's something on which it's encroaching. It's not that you just need to sort of do a Humean, well, what sort of beliefs is it the having of which was be such that it would make me happiest, or whatever it might be. Right, if only I could. Of course, psychologically, you can't switch beliefs on and off like tap, so it's not going to be feasible. But if only I could, I'd switch over to that set of beliefs right now, and be reasonable in doing so. Yeah, so there is a difference there for sure, for sure. All we do is reveal differences between us, whatever we talk about.
Gosh, yeah, for sure. So, what it seems like your argument would I don't what when you the original topic was, should we have reasons to believe in a God? And it
Yeah,
seems like you're arguing for that there is some kind of objective normative reason.
yeah.
And so your answer would be yes, that we should have reasons, and one of them is this
Um,
normative reason or something.
okay. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think I may not have been as clear as I categorically ought to have been. Um, So in the paper, it looks as if there are these two questions: do we, as a matter of fact, have more reasons to believe in God than we have to believe that God doesn't exist, or more reason to believe that God doesn't exist than to believe that He does, or an equal balance of reasons, or no reasons on either side, which I guess would be a special case of there being an equal balance. Yeah, there's that question: what reasons do we have for and against believing God? And there's another question of what answer to that question do we need it? Do we need that question to have before it's permissible for us to believe in God? So this is the question of the ethics of belief in God, and the paper suggests okay, it looks initially as if that question, should we have reason to believe in God, has a methodological priority to the question of whether or not we do have reasons. We might want to decide, well, what is the right ethics of belief in God? What sort of standard should I expect reasons for God to meet before I think, well, okay, given that the reasons have met that standard, then I should believe or shouldn't believe. Right, let's try and find out what the right ethics of belief for God is as a priority, and then we'll go on and look at what reasons we have for and against belief in God. And in the paper, I make an argument to the effect that you can't actually, unfortunately, answer the question that looks as if it has methodological priority before you've answered the question of whether we do have reasons to believe in God or not. And there are various sort of lines of thinking there, but one might be that, and it's a little bit rough, but it might be that, look, if there isn't a God, then it is probably the case that you ought not to believe in God unless you had lots of evidence for him. If there is a God, that becomes less clear, because if there is a God, it's quite plausible that he would have made us such that it was permissible to believe in him, even absent good evidence, if he had certain reasons to remain sort of hidden, problem of evil, these sort of zones. So therefore, whether or not the ethics of belief in God is the more exigent, look, you should really only believe in God if you've got some pretty good arguments on your side, or the more relaxed, no, it's fine to believe in God even if you don't have good arguments on your side. Which of those is the right view cannot unfortunately be decided prior to answering whether or not there's a God. Does that make sense? So I think I've gone around the houses a bit, but maybe not made it too clear.
I think so, but I think I would argue that would suffer from the same criticism you applied earlier, that it's less simple. Because in that case, to say that it's rational to believe in God, you have to believe there is a God already, and that he designed the universe such that having this belief is rational in some way. Whereas the belief that you shouldn't starts with something simpler, which is just your direct experience. Like, you have direct experience. Some of them are you can that you can interact with, like cameras and TV. Some of them you can't, like unicorns and leprechauns. And so we have some difference between kinds of things we experience and believe. And so we already have some justification that we need to take any particular belief and filter which of these segments it goes into. And it seems like we have that regardless of which starting point you have. And then to go further and say that, well, I believe God exists and he made it such that this one belief is an exception to this rule, seems like it's less simple and more complicated. And so we should reject it for that reason, at least, as being as rational as the other approach of applying the God belief to the same methodology we apply every other belief to.
I probably think we don't. The belief in God is not on this second ethic of belief is not most plausibly rendered as the unique belief about which this is true. There will probably be other beliefs, such that Russell's 5-minute hypothesis is false, or we weren't all created 5 minutes ago with a load of false memories. That others have minds. That the future will resemble the past more or less in the rough way we need to suppose it to resemble the past if the project of science is to make sense. There's an external world out there independent of our sensory perceptions of it, and that nevertheless our sensory perceptions are telling us more or less accurately about what that world is like in broad macroscopic respects, even if not in the microscopic ones. I'd say there's probably a lot of beliefs which we have which are such that it's permissible for us to have them, even though we don't have very good reasons, if any reasons, for the having of them. And this person is saying, having populated this category with a number of beliefs already, I'm opening the idea that it might be all right to pop the belief that God exists in there with those things. And you might think, if you think that God doesn't exist, you'll think, well, I'm pretty unsympathetic to the idea that you could pop God into this bucket.
Well, I would go further. I would say I wouldn't put anything in that category. I'd say, why would we accept this category where there is a set of beliefs that don't need justification? Why would my method here not be better of starting with, I exist, I have a direct experience, and I need to put everything, any belief of any kind, I need some method to differentiate between these two and put it in one category or the other. And I don't need the method to be perfect, but you need something. You can't just say there are these certain set of beliefs that need no justification. I would say that we should get rid of that category altogether. And so say I believe in other minds, I can believe that based off of some reasons that I've applied this method to differentiate imagination from real things. It seems to work. You seem to be on the real category. And from that, I can use some inductive justification. So, yep, I'm justified in believing there are other minds. Is it perfect? Nope. I don't need to be perfect. I've used this method. And so it's not unjustified. And so I seem to be able to apply that to every one of the cases you listed and give me some justification, even though if it may not be sufficient or whatever. And that seems to be a better approach than to allow this category to exist and start placing things in it of things that do not need justification.
Yeah, and I want so and to the you'd say, so your belief is a red patch. You'd say that is justified by an experience you've had. Yes, I'm just thinking because you'd say, look, I don't think there are any beliefs that need no justification. And I was saying, oh, what about your when we went around this little bit of territory earlier on? I seem to remember I said, oh, well, what about your foundational beliefs? Those are presumably beliefs for which you have no justification. And did you say, oh no, that's true? I don't have any justification. I have experiences which ground them, or something. I'm sorry.
Well, the experiences are the justification. So I have an experience of a red leaf or whatever is a justification for the belief that I have an experience there as a red leaf.
Yeah.
It's not a justification a red leaf exists in the external world, but it is a justification that for the belief I have an experience of a red leaf. And so
Yeah.
the experience itself acts as a justification for retroactive beliefs about the experience. And so for all conceptual things, all things that we are just saying are true in our mind, 1 + 1 = 2, A = A, I'm having thoughts and experiences, as long as you maintain the proposition to the limits of your brain, the experience itself is a justification and is a sufficient justification. Once you go beyond that and say the red leaf exists in the external world, then you would need to apply the methodology to differentiate, is it imaginary, is it real, and to have that one be justified. So there's two different classes there. One is the conceptual claims in our head, which can be justified simply by the fact you imagine them. And two would be the empirical claims, or I'll just use the word empirical, for things outside of your imagination. And you would need that further methodology to justify those.
Yeah. And so the first belief you come to, which has, if you like, below it in the structure, no further belief, but only an experience which is providing the justifying ground for that first belief. That will be a belief which is of its nature such that if someone said to you, can you give me a reason to have the same belief? You would say, well, no, I can't give you a reason to have the same belief because you haven't had the experience, which is for me the reason to have the belief that I've had. So it would be a belief which you took yourself as all things considered a reasonable person in having, and yet for which you could provide to no second party a reason which you could expect that they, or which they would be right to accept as a reason for them to have that belief. Is that right?
Yeah, they couldn't have the same foundational experience as I could. I can't like show you my direct experience. I mean, so the only kind of justification you could have for me seeing a red leaf or whatever would be of that second order things. You'd have to have your own starting position and your own methodology to differentiate imagination from reality. I would have to land on the reality side of that, and then you could use some kind of reasoning to justify that I saw a red leaf. But you would never be able to use my direct experience.
Yeah. And so I'm sorry, and I remember going around this a little bit better now. And that's, I think, why I then was led to think about the sort of person who would say, okay, I don't actually need to contend on that ground, because I could say, sure, my view is that you can, this person speaking, that it's permissible for you to believe in God without any reason of a sort which you can convey publicly in the form of a design argument or cosmological argument or what have you for the existence of God, for you nevertheless to believe that God exists. How could it be permissible for you to believe that God exists in the absence of any reasons of that sort, the reasons that could be given by way of a series of propositions that you sort of put out on a whiteboard, and then you say, I'm going to defend the premises 1 to 5 and the validity of this, and therefore the conclusion 6, whatever it is? What would that look like? I say, oh, well, it would be my experience. So it's not that these things are groundless beliefs that sort of pop up without any explanation for why they pop up rather than don't. Oh, sure, I've had experiences. My experiences are uniquely religious, or not uniquely, other people have them, but unique amongst experiences in that they're religious in character, but they're not unique in terms of them being devoid of defeasibility in principle, as the example of the Peter Sutcliffe character shows. So they might say, yeah, okay, I'm all right with that. It's permissible to believe that God exists without any evidence, whereby evidence we mean a thing that can be shared between different thinkers and assessed independently by the different thinkers. They'll say, yeah, okay, I've got my evidence and my religious experience, and indeed that is not communicable to you. I mean, I can communicate to you the fact that I've got it, but it's not directly going to be evidence for you. Maybe the principle of testimony will make evidence for you. Actually, they might want to run that too. It's compatible to run that too, but they no need to.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I don't really care if the information can be transmitted to me or not. That makes no difference. It's irrelevant to my epistemology. My question would be more, does whatever methodology you're using, whether you can communicate it to me or not, I don't really care. Is it able to filter out all of the fallacies, biases, intuitions, delusions that humans have? Or I would first ask, do you have these things? Are you a human? Do you have the same experiences? Yes, is there some difference? And then if you establish that you are human and you do have these things, I would ask, does your methodology filter them out? And can you demonstrate that in some case? Not to me, to you, to yourself. It doesn't matter if you can demonstrate it to me. I don't care. And if you can't, then I'd say you are probably not justified if you want to believe rationally. And so it's not really important to my epistemology whether or not you can convince another person of your belief. Mine is a consistency claim of, if you have the same experiences I have, that there's some difference between your imagination and reality. Does your methodology able to differentiate between those two things? And if not, then you wouldn't be justified in believing that, regardless of what I can be shown.
Yeah. I mean, most people, of course, are going to believe that their own principles enable them to distinguish more or less accurately between reality and things they're merely imagining. Most people, I guess, if you know of yourself that you're prone to hallucinations, and the doctor has told you that if you tail off in your medicines it's going to get worse, and you know of yourself that, oh, hang on, I've forgotten to take my medicine this morning. So I can come up with some gerrymandered examples where a person will believe that they can no longer distinguish tolerably accurately between perception and reality. But most people will think that they're satisfying that condition.
Oh yeah, I think literally everyone almost starts with that belief that they're satisfying that condition.
Yeah.
But then you would present contravening defeaters like, do you know what confirmation bias is? Do you know what anthropocentric fallacies are? Do you know what type 1 and type 2 errors are? And once you present all of these fallacies and biases that we know exist in the human mind, if they can understand that those are the case and understand that they could explain the data, then they'd have to find a way to believe that God existing would be more plausible than it being a type 1 or type 2 error. And that would be the methodology. Does your methodology have a way to differentiate God existing from type 1 or type 2 errors? And if they don't have that...
What if they because then they could go two routes. Either they say, oh, so yeah, no, I've heard of these things and this is what I do with them. And then they sort of, fight it on that ground. And you might think would fail on that ground. And okay. What if they say, oh, yeah, I've heard of these so-called cognitive biases. I mean, some of them I've heard of, and I don't even need to preface so-called with them. But there'll be a set of these which I think are inappropriate to think that one needs to combat. And so, I think it's rather wonderful that God has put us in a world where once we start believing in him, we find more and more evidence in favor of his existence. And I remember when I first converted, I didn't see a sunset and think of it as God's handiwork. Whereas now, whenever I see a sunset, I can't help but interpret it as evidence of God's handiwork. And so you will say, well, this is just some confirmation bias that you've got
Well,
yourself.
I would not. I would ask a question. I'd say,
Yeah.
what reason do you have to say that this set of beliefs is immune to confirmation bias, as opposed to all other set of beliefs which are not immune? And that would be my next question.
Well, suppose they say, well, because on the view to which I've been drawn, this is just the sort of happy, virtuous epistemic spiral that a God would want us to get into with regards to looking at sunsets. So there's a circularity here. There'd be no reason to believe this if you weren't already of the person's religious beliefs, but they are of those beliefs, and so they now don't count as confirmation bias. What someone looking in might think was pretty clearly a case of confirmation bias.
Well, I would test their methodology versus my methodology on the things that we can agree upon to see which one can accurately discern real things from fake things in the category of things we agree upon, and then to establish which one works better.
Yeah, I was just thinking that they probably come out pretty evens on that, because this is a quite compartmentalized set of views. I mean, if they say, oh, so therefore I'll expect water to turn into wine every Thursday at the local restaurant, let's go there. Oh, okay, well thanks. Let's go there, and we'll find that you're wrong, and that'll be a nice conclusive refutation. But I was assuming they wouldn't do that. They'd you just keep looking at their sunsets with this sort of look of religious awe, and you just keep saying, I'm not seeing what you're seeing.
Well, there's two parts there. One would be is if they start with the belief God exists and God would create the universe 13.8 billion years old or whatever, and then expect to see papers of scientists that see this, then they'd be justified in that belief. But I would, if they had some methodology where they said that they're trying to understand, like I would look at the methodology itself and say, okay, let's apply this methodology of saying that God has isolated this one belief and say it's immune to confirmation bias or something, and see if that methodology, independent of the God, would work to describe reality versus a methodology that is based upon testable predictions. Like I say there are these testable predictions.
You say they might say, look, I think we all say that sometimes you can overdiagnose confirmation bias. Once you've decided confirmation bias is prevalent, you look for confirmation of your belief that it's prevalent wherever you can find it. But would you say that your own continuing belief that you exist is this is terrible confirmation bias, because of course he's already decided he exists, so he's going to find more and more evidence he exists? Or would you say, well, no, that's not really an appropriate deployment of the notion of confirmation bias?
Well, I'd say that'd be fine. I'd say that the difference here is, do you think every belief has to be differentiated? Is it confirmation bias versus is it not confirmation bias? Versus, do you think there's some subset that you don't even test? I'd say that whether you over or underplay confirmation bias, as long as you have some methodology that you're trying to differentiate the two, that would be better than isolating some class of beliefs and saying these don't even get tested.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, they could be testable, but sometimes they seem a little bit I suppose I wonder if I think that the intellectual vice of confirmation bias is prevalent, and it's always worth asking if some particular piece of reasoning has been subject to that vice, but that quite often the answer will come back that, well, it hasn't been. And sometimes the answer will come back as, well, it's not really the sort of thing to which confirmation bias is relevant. So when it's not, oh well, you only believe that modus ponens is a good way of reasoning and is going to be a good way of reasoning into the future because it's worked for you in the past or something, and you should be a little bit open-minded about whether or not it's going to work in the future. I think, well, that doesn't seem to be the right idea. It's not something.
I would agree. So I would say that in the case of conceptual claims, things that are only true virtue of your imagination, you don't need that. But if you're making the claim about something that is true independent of your imagination, then all of those claims should be tested. I don't know of any claims about external things existing that should not be tested. to
Yeah.
avoid confirmation bias.
Yeah. And I think I was slightly put off because in your imagination, I thought, oh, immediate sort of sensory experiences. Oh, it seems to me as if there's a red patch and I'm imagining a pink flower right now or something. Whereas I'd think of your belief in logic to me not just simply a matter of your imagination, but but maybe this is because I'm more Platonist about these sorts of things. So okay, anyway, yeah, you'd say okay, no, I mean fair enough. With belief in logic is the same. Yeah, good. So where does this leave the ethics of believing in God? I don't know really. What do you think?
Well, I would say we should treat God claims as any claims of any external non-imaginary thing and put it to the same methodological test we do all of those
Yeah,
things, and only believe it's only rational to believe in it if it lands on the side of non-imaginary, depending on whichever methodology you're using.
yeah. And what would you say to someone who said that? So that sounds like an endorsement of the as you start off indeed by endorsing, the first view I consider in the paper, and you take that view initially. Sounds like an endorsement. What do you say to someone who says, that's not the right ethics of belief for belief in God? If there is a God who has created us such that we function properly when, at least some of the time, when at least some of us believe in God absent reasons, and so until you've ruled out as a possibility that a God of that sort exists, you can't be sure that yours is the right ethics of belief, because if a God of that sort did exist, then the ethics of belief would be different.
Well, I'd say that's a less simple hypothesis than starting with our direct experience and saying there's some difference between imagination and reality. We need a methodology to differentiate that between, and then take all possible hypotheses and put it through this filter. Seems to be says all of the same data on both of us. For both of us, we all start with the same data with this hypothesis, but yours seems to entail some kind of extra thing you have to assume is there that interferes with the data and messes with it. And if we do that, we could just pick a different hypothesis and mess with the data in an alternative way to come up with an alternative conclusion. And so that's methodology, because it adds in some extra complexity, which we can then use to make alternative hypotheses that are equally complex but have variations, is a less rational thing to adopt than the one I'm using. And so I would say I would not think that is as accurate methodology to try and represent reality as mine.
Yeah, because I think they might incline to say, or at least I'd be sympathetic to them, were they to say, you're giving some reasons to think that there isn't a being of that sort, because that being would be more complicated. But I was making the conditional claim that if there was a being of that sort, then the ethics of belief would be a lot more relaxed than you think they are. And so, apropos of my paper, I agree with you in that I think you're showing that you can't actually decide what the right ethics of belief for belief in God is, independently of deciding whether you've got good reasons to believe that God exists or doesn't, because your reasons for thinking that their ethics of belief was wrong required you to show that it was not very likely that their God existed relative to a simpler hypothesis, which would adequately, if not better, explain the data that we have. So I think there's probably not much in my paper you'll disagree with, although then I think the things which are off stage that you and I, so as we've indicated, for the last hour and however long it's been.
Well, I don't think I would. I don't think I would agree with that. Where I'd say my methodology gives some reason to think their God does not exist, because I don't think mine, because they have the same experience presumably that I do. They have a direct experience, and there's a difference between their imagination and reality. So they have the same things there, and requiring that and saying that we need some method to differentiate between these two things wouldn't exclude God. It wouldn't, because God can still say.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'd say that in this case, if we're both starting with this position that we need some way to differentiate, it could lead one way or the other.
Yes.
And so I think this way you can't say it's worse because they have the exact same experiences that I do in this context.
Yeah.
So they couldn't eliminate this and say it's a bad option.
Yeah. So I think it's you can say, look, I believe, so two people who believe in God one person can say, look, I believe that God has created us such that he's made it permissible for us to believe that he exists without any evidence, without any arguments of the sort that can be conveyed to other persons, even if it's only through religious experiences grounding the belief that is then a properly basic belief. This is the way that God has set it up. So I believe the right ethics of belief for large numbers of people is such that it's permissible for them to believe absent evidence of that sort. And the other person says, I believe in God too, so we're in agreement there. However, I think you're wrong there. I think that God has created us such that it's only permissible for us to believe that he exists if we have ourselves marshaled and accumulated a certain number of reasons and also some defeaters of the problem.
Well, so I think I want to clarify there.
Religion. So each of those people believes in God.
Let me interrupt for 1 second. So I think that the fact that there's some difference between our imagination and our experience entails the second view, because we know that some of the things we imagine don't exist. We know that this is the case. Then you have to adopt the second view because of the fallibility of your mind. You know that even if there's a God who created you, he created you with this problem. There's a problem in your brain and it doesn't work in some cases. And because of that, you have to apply this methodology to differentiate. And so unless you were born and had zero flaws in your brain, in which case any beliefs you have could be justified from your perspective, then you wouldn't, because you don't have any defeaters, you're justified in believing whatever beliefs you have. But once you realize some of your beliefs can be false, now you know the constitution of your brain has this problem and you have to apply that to all of the potential beliefs. And so I think because we know that our brain has flaws, we already have a defeater for this belief that God has made us such the case that we can just rationally believe in him for no reason, because we have this fallibility.
Couldn't the person say, "Oh, I accept all that. I accept that we're fallible. We can make mistakes and so on, and God tolerates that. That's part of my model. He's just also created us such that we're not well." Given that he exists, whenever anyone comes to the belief that he exists, they come to a true belief. So they can't. That is a belief which is infallible in that it's a belief which, if you formulate it, cannot be wrong because it's a belief about the existence of a being, the existence of which is necessary. So we're fallible in other areas, but we're not fallible about this. And if they're right that there is such a being, well, yeah, okay.
That would seem like special pleading. It would seem like you've added in
this
extra thing.
It is, yeah. I think it's. I mean, it reminds me a bit of the sort of Nozick's sort of definition of knowledge and getting out of the experience machine sort of example. That if we are in a world where the belief is formed, yada 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 way, well, then it counts as knowledge. Oh yeah, and we are actually in that world, so we're not in an experience machine. So we know we're not. We know that there's I'm waving a hand in front of my face or whatever it is, the thing that we know. Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, it's. Well, I don't know if I call it special pleading. It's. Well, I think
in yours, because you said in this one case, it is. That's why I think it's special pleading.
Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
When you said, because you said in this one case of this necessary being, this one case it applies, which seems like special pleading to me because you're isolating this one specific example.
Yeah, God. They might have a view that God might have made it so I did have it as one case, but they could hold, if that's a stumbling block, they could say, oh yeah, and God has also made it the case that we can. We can never go wrong when we add one and one together. Might be right. Has anyone ever gone wrong when they've added one and one together? Maybe they have. But some clear and distinct ideas. Whatever Descartes was labeling clear and distinct ideas, those are the things that there's a class there, and God exists is one of them. There may be others. I don't know. I thought they might be able to do some wiggling here. It's special pleading. Yeah, God is special. Let's say.
But I would say that the approach you're applying would probably have the same problems as the approach Nozick applies. And I don't like either of those. I think both of those are less good than the approach I apply, which is I start with my existence. There's some difference in my imagination experience, apply a methodology. That seems to be less problematic than the ones you're applying.
Yes. Suppose they say, I mean, problematic is maybe too much for them to have conceded, but that your view is less problematic. But suppose they say it could, even if it is in some sense less problematic, be overly rigorous, demanding rather more of yourself than you need to demand of yourself. And it would be rather overly rigorous if there is, in fact, in relation to the religious topic, if there is, in fact, a God who has created you such that, or maybe this is going to assume an objectivity about value, though, that you wouldn't like, such that you don't need to be as rigorous with yourself as you are in order to meet your objective epistemic obligations. You could, and these people will say, "Oh, you know, I'm not being as rigorous as you." and if there is such a God, then I am maybe nevertheless meeting my epistemic obligations. Yeah. No,
Well, I still think there would need to be some kind of a reason that could identify these particular set of beliefs to say that they are excluded from this criterion. Because as soon as we know that we have some flaw in our brain, it seems like rational to apply that to all possible beliefs rather than saying, "Oh, here's a class we're gonna doesn't apply to these. These don't apply." There need to be some reason to identify those, as opposed to just special pleading. I'm going to pick this belief. I like this belief. I am the smartest person in the world. We're going to put that one in there. I like that one. I'm the most attractive person in the world. We're going to put that one in there. It's a nice belief. So it seems we need some kind of, again, the rational justification to put a particular set of beliefs into that category, rather than just saying, here's a category and I don't know, pick the ones I like.
Yes, yeah, they wouldn't be saying that. They'd be saying, I suppose they're saying, well, it's not up to me to pick what beliefs go into this, what category and what don't. If there's a God, then he could have picked which beliefs go into which category and which don't, maybe only within limits. But anyway, they say, and he would have picked them such that this belief in him fell into a category different from the category you think it falls into. Now, it is special pleading. I like that phrase, and I need to think about it a bit more, in that it's that God would have been motivated to make belief in him more epistemically sort of respectable than belief in something else that would also, you know, he could have.
Flying spaghetti monster.
Yes, for sure. And that's because the flying spaghetti monster doesn't exist. And so they would certainly not have been motivated to make that belief epistemically respectable. And beliefs in certain other beliefs and things that do exist, like that there's a, you know, odd number of rocks on the far side of the moon. I mean, that's a bit of a vague claim, you know, what it means anyway, but rather than an even number, but somehow, yeah, those are things he's not going to have made as he's been motivated to make epistemically respectable. So it's sort of special pleading. It's the sort of special pleading God would, were he to exist, be likely to engage in. And we are looping back round to certain other presumptions here, aren't we? Where, yeah, I obviously have some idea about, well, if there were a God, you know, or I take myself to have an idea about what it would be like were there to be a God, how he'd be motivated. And, you know, I think I can get this out of what he'd have objective reason to do. You will think I'm interpolating into his mind bits of psychology.
Well, yeah, so the special pleading, I think, is that I'm concerned about isn't the special pleading God would do, but the special pleading you would particularly do. How did you identify those beliefs are outside of this differentiation between imagination and reality? How did you pick those particular beliefs? If there isn't a particular methodology you're using, and it seems like special pleading for you to do that.
Yeah. Yes. It'll seem like special pleading in some problematic way to those on the outside, just as it'll seem like special pleading to an imaginary person then who says, oh, why do you think that logic is immune from this? Or first person reports about how your experiences seem to you are immune from this. What is it that you make immune from this? Oh, that seems like special pleading to me. So they'll try to do a U2 move against you there, I think.
Well, I would say I'm not choosing any of these. I'm saying I have a methodology. Specifically, the things that I'm only claiming are true about my imagination are things that I don't need some kind of to apply this methodology to, because they're only true about my imagination. So if I have a direct experience of a leaf, The fact that I'm having an experience is something that's true simply because it's describing the experience. And so I don't need to say that this needs to be differentiated between imagination and reality, because I don't care. It could be either one. It's fine. It doesn't make a difference to the claim. So if it's imaginary, that's true. If it's reality, it's still true that I'm having an experience. And so I don't need to differentiate between the two, because either one, the claim is still going to be true either way. It makes no difference.
Yeah. There will be some skeptical issues even about this, though. The red patch example reminds me that, how do you know it's a red patch that you were imagining rather than, a purple patch? It's just your memory deceived you about, what color, how red seemed to you the last time you imagined it, and so on. You've got a methodology there, have you?
Well, would that make a difference? So like if I said I'm seeing a red patch, even if it was my brain misinterpreting purple or something, the fact that I'm still having an experience of a red patch would still be true, by virtue of just, I mean by the words, I'm simply describing the experience I'm having.
Yeah. So some people would worry that the language you're using can't be made to work in that sort of scenario. You can't. I mean, this is somewhat orthogonal to our main line of thinking here, insofar as I can pick out the thinking. But you might, if Wittgenstein was hearing our earlier discussion about the red patch, he'd probably be tearing his hair out and saying, "This is not the right way to think about how it is we imagine red patches, or can talk about what it is to imagine red patches." Yeah.
Well, I agree. There's the problem of like, in the way that my brain works, I'm trying to identify the word red, but my brain makes a mistake and identifies the word purple. And so the word I'm saying is an inaccurate representation of the thing I'm trying to say. But that would be, since I'm not necessarily talking to anybody here but myself, if I'm saying I'm seeing a red patch and I'm having an experience of a red patch, it wouldn't make a difference whether or not the word accurately represented the thing I'm trying to say, because I'm just trying to make up words to represent the thing I'm experiencing. And whether or not those words are accurate doesn't make much of a difference. The justification for those words, whatever they are, is the fact that I'm trying to describe my experience. And the particular words don't matter one way or the other. Whether or not I correctly identify them doesn't matter either. All that matters is the words I'm doing are justified by the fact that I'm having the experience.
Yeah. So it was a little bit of a red herring, really. It just occurred to me that someone who's totally impressed by the private language argument would have wanted to say, well, you've got problems over here, but they would have wanted to say that you were not going to be terribly impressed by the private language argument, so you'll bat that away. And I can't really actually now remember why I thought, oh, it's not as if you've got no skeptical issues even at this level of your understanding of what's going on. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, depending on the private language argument, which would be a whole other discussion. But I think you'll say, no, don't come around here, Wittgenstein, with your private language argument. It doesn't work.
I'm just going to quote Noam Chomsky. If anybody brings up the private language argument or Wittgenstein or the combination Wittgenstein and whoever else, Kripke and Wittgenstein, like, yeah, I'm going to throw Noam Chomsky at you. This is not how language works. Go away.
Okay, good. Yes, good. Fair enough. Yeah, good. Right. Okay. Well, I don't know. I'm not aware of anything else that I wanted to say that I haven't said. Anyone who's listening to this or watching this, the video froze as I indicated a while ago on me, so I haven't been able to watch what's been going on, but for a while. But who wants to follow up the paper? I think the link is there.
In the
yeah,
description.
the claim in the paper, just to repeat, is not that any one of these can be known to be right in advance of working out whether or not God exists. The claim is the one that it's perhaps surprising and hence interesting that you can't really know what the right ethics of belief for belief in God is until you've got at least some of the way down the road of finding out whether you've got more reasons to believe in God or more reasons against. And that's argued for in the paper. So, please read that if you think it'd be interesting. So that's all I have to say. But Tom, sorry, you might have lots of other things you need to tell me I'm wrong about.
Oh, no, that was good. I think we had a great conversation. I, of course, think you can. I think you need the fact that your brain has problems gives you the answer immediately. Like, once you know that your brain has problems, you need a reason. That would be my epistemological justification.
Yeah.
And
well, I certainly know my brain has problems.
It's a good one. I'm going to clip that. I'm going to clip that. Post it.
Oh no, please. That's more profound than that.
But we have been going for about 2 hours. It was a great
Okay.
conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references other than the
No,
one in the description?
just that paper. But I have written books and 50 odd papers, and if anyone reads that paper and thinks this is so wonderful, I'd love to read more of this guy's stuff. They can find me at, so my name is Tim Mawson, Tim, and then surname Mawson, Mawson. And if you go to Oxford University's philosophy faculty, I've got a web page there, or is it a page? It's on their page, maybe. Anyway, you'll find me there, and there's a link of all my publications there, the ones that exist. And if you find a title and it says, "Oh, it's behind a paywall," email me, because I'm always delighted to send copies of papers in response to emails to anyone who might read them. So don't let the fact it's behind a paywall stop you getting at it if you really want to read it.
Awesome. Thanks again. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much. And you too. Lovely to speak to you as always.